I'm going to tie up another woolly bugger here today. This is what I call the more contemporary version of the woolly bugger. If you saw the video I did last week on the Russell Blessing version of the woolly bugger, that was more or less how he, the creator of the woolly bugger, tied it originally. And I like to include these from time to time as a kind of a comparison thing because, you know, any of these flies, one person ties it and then other people start tying it, and next thing you know, lots of people are tying it. They come up with different ways of doing it. So these are what I consider more contemporary, the ones that I'm going to show you today, how most people tie them if you look at online instruction or even written instruction. So there's two different ways I'm going to show and demonstrate that today. So that's the woolly bugger, and I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start the woolly bugger, what I'm calling a more contemporary woolly bugger, with my hook and the vise. This is a Mustad 9672 in a size 6. It's about a 4x long hook shank on this. Some will say it's a 3x long. It just depends on some of that definition. But it's a longer shanked hook for the woolly bugger. You could do this on a shorter shank if you want, or even longer if you want. After debarbing the hook, I'm going to attach my thread. I'm using a UTC 140 Denier in olive, because this is going to be an olive woolly bugger. So like the one that I did last week, which was what I call the Russell Blessing version, this is going to be an olive bugger, and it's going to be tied almost the same way. There's just some subtle differences. Now, there's two different ways I'm going to show this today, and simply because this particular, the more contemporary version, uses a wire rib in it. And a lot of people, when they have learned how to tie this, whether they have watched videos or had somebody else teach them or whatever, they're taught to put a wire rib in this. And it's actually a good idea, because when you wrap in the hackle on this woolly bugger, without that rib, you've got the hackle anchored down here in the back, wrapped on and anchored in the front. If you're fighting a fish, you hit a branch, a rock, who knows what, but that rachis breaks anywhere in there, all of that hackle comes unraveled. So the idea is that the wire is going to help to reinforce. You could use a heavier wire if you want to give it a little bit more weight. You could use a different colored wire to give it a little bit different flash or different color if you want. So you can use the wire in that regard if that's the effect you're looking for. I'm not really looking for that as much as to secure this. So I'm just using this is just a fine gold wire. I'm going to tie this in. That's the first item after attaching the tail that I'm going to tie in. And notice the tail, I put it in and used the Marabou as an underbody, just like in the previous version. Next, I'm going to put my hackle in. For a hackle, this is a Whiting's Bugger Pack. It just has some really nice, there's some finer hackles for smaller buggers, but on the back it has some really, really nice, broad hackles here, nice and long for this particular fly. In the Russell Blessing version, the chenille was tied in first and the hackle was tied in second. This is the way I learned how to tie woolly buggers and taught them for many years. For many years I taught it without the wire, but next you just tie in your hackle. And then we're going to use the chenille. Same olive chenille. It's a medium Rayon chenille that we used in the previous video on the woolly bugger. I'm going to attach that to the hook shank and then wrap this forward, leaving myself about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to wrap that chenille in, twist it up a little bit just to get it a little more solid. And notice I'm not making certain that there is a wrap behind the hackle. As a matter of fact, the hackle will actually start at the very end behind the chenille. Like I said, this is just kind of more of a contemporary version of the woolly bugger, meaning that most people these days, most instruction you're going to see, this is how they tend to tie it. And again, showing the different versions, it's not a question of what's right or what's wrong. It's just there's different ways of doing it. And fortunately, having different ways of doing it is good because some people prefer certain ways and they're more comfortable with certain ways of doing this. Now, as I said, most of my woolly buggers, when I taught them, I didn't have the wire in here. I would just simply, after the chenille is applied, I would apply the hackle. I put one wrap of hackle right at the very back. Starts to give me those legs sticking out. And then I'm going to put in about 5 wraps. I find that's, enough. If you really, really want to make this thing look thick and everything, you could put more, but I don't. I just like this more of the suggestion. And then I'm going to put 2 or 3 wraps right in front, kind of giving this a little bit of a broader face. I'm going to secure the end of that hackle in. Trim that away. Clean this up just a little bit to get our wire in. Now the wire, to have this, you could put this in with, say, just 3 or 4 wraps, and it would wrap over the top of that rachis and it would protect it. But to really maximize it, I like to put in about 4 wraps, 1 or 2 wraps less than I did the hackle, but I also go the opposite direction. This can, if you're not careful, end up laying some barbs down. Even if you are careful, it just by nature, you're kind of the way you're going, it tends to sometimes grab some of them. I don't get too overly concerned about that. Again, this is still going to ride in the water just fine. It's going to look just fine. Once you secure the wire in, we can fatigue that wire and get it right off. Stroking all of this back again. I'm going to clean this up, making the head five or 6 turn whip finish. And this woolly bugger's done. Put some head cement on that. As you can see, that wire's in there. You can see it, so it does add a little bit of glint, a little flash or whatever, but it's mostly there just to help protect that rachis. Now, as I said, there's 2 different ways that people tie this. This is a very common way by anchoring everything back at the end here, wrapping it in sequence up towards the front. The second way I'm going to show you is a little bit different, and there's a number of videos out there on how to do this. I've already got part of a woolly bugger started, so that it kind of speeds this up a little bit. I'll attach my thread. And this one starts out very similar in that you're going to put your tail on, same way. We're going to put our wire in. I want to make certain you have a long enough wire that you're not going to slip out of your fingers while you're tying this. But instead of tying in our hackle next, we're going to tie in our chenille. The reason is this particular method, our hackle gets tied in up front, wound to the back, and then the wire gets wrapped over it, anchoring it down. And so it has two functions. It anchors the hackle back here after you've wrapped it on, and then when it's wrapped up, it reinforces it. A little bit different way of doing it. Seen, a number of people have done this, and even on some other dry flies and like the elk hair caddis, I've seen, tied this way. There's other applications where there's a wire going over hackle. You can use this technique in. I just more or less wanted to show different ways that people tie the woolly bugger. Again, not saying one's better than the other. It's just a different way of doing it. You may prefer a certain way. And actually, this method here, if I'm going to be putting in a wire on the woolly buggers, this method is the one that I prefer. The other's a little bit easier, but this one I think gets better results, and I'll explain that in just a second here. So with our chenille tied in, I'm going to smooth this area off, clean this up just a little bit. I tend to end up with a little bit bigger heads on these. Now for the hackle on this, you're going to want to, you don't want to clip the hackle way down here on that rachis, because the hackle will crack as soon as you start to wrap that in. So you want to find where the sweet spot is, right about in here where it's narrowed down, that it is still thick and it's got some nice broad barbs on it, but it won't snap on you and break. If you have to, you can cut that further down, but I would soak them in water first for a while, let that rachis absorb a little bit of water and soften up just a little bit. Make certain you're getting this tied in well. I do tend to have on these with the wire, the heads are a little bit bigger. I don't think it affects the fly. So here I'll get a couple of wraps in right at the front and then start winding backwards. I do need to use my hackle pliers on this because it's kind of short. Again, I'm only getting about 4. Let me go back. I think I can get another wrap in there. About 5 wraps here. Okay, 5.5, maybe 6. Notice as I come up here on this last one, the hackle is just right at the end of the chenille, right where my wire is. So now I bring that wire up and around. I trap in the tip of that hackle. I'm going to set this down, and then I'm going to wrap forward. Now notice that I'm, just by nature of how this is wrapped, I am wrapping over the top of that rachis and therefore securing it. I find that this method for some reason doesn't lay down as many hackles underneath that wire, and it just looks a little bit better. But then maybe that's just me thinking that. Secure that wire like I did before. Then I can fatigue that wire off. stroking all of this back. I'm going to go ahead and tidy this up a little bit. Four or five turn whip finish. And that flat thread is spreading out on me there more than I want it to. So I'm going to go back here and undo this. And I'm going to actually put a twist in my thread here. And unfortunately, I've mentioned this in other videos that this happens sometimes if you get the heads on these. Let's see if I can unwrap this. If they end up not being really smooth, you end up with this kind of thing happening where, all right, now we're losing this. Before I finish this, let me explain this here. The back end here, a lot of times people will, when they start to wrap that wire on, then they just go ahead and pop this off. The only downside to this is that I have had situations where when I pop this off, for some reason, it comes out from underneath the wire in the back. Sometimes it doesn't. You could have done that right when you wrap the wire off just to be done with that step. Now, back to this. As I said, sometimes, especially with some of these flatter threads, they'll spread out and they slide around. Probably should have put some wax on that. I'll do that here. As I've mentioned in other videos, fly tying is not perfect. Sometimes the process doesn't go always as smooth as you want. So we shall break our thread. All right, so this was supposed to be just a quick, easy example of another way of tying that. And for some reason the head is just being persnickety on me here. Well, I'm going to get a couple wraps in here, cleaning this up a little bit, and then a whip finish, and we're done. Okay, I think we got it that time. So a little head cement, and there you have it. Could just do a whole new video, but like I said, I kind of like to throw in some of the mistakes sometimes. It's nice when it all works out really nice and smooth, but you know what? That's not always the case, and it's still fun. I've got a great fly that is very productive here in central Indiana, the olive woolly bugger. And there's two different ways now, three different ways actually now you know to tie a woolly bugger. Best is to basic woolly bugger. There's another method that I'm going to show. I got one more video that's kind of unique. It's a little bit different. And I've only ever seen one person tying it that way, but that'll be coming out next week. So there's a woolly bugger. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.